Today, Turkey and Russia announced a ceasefire in Idlib, Syria, the final stronghold of fighters who are opposed to Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. Turkey has been fighting in Idlib against Syria and its ally, Russia. And that fighting has helped push refugees to the Syria-Turkey border and separately to the Turkey-Greece border. As Nick Schifrin reports, today's ceasefire will likely be temporary, and refugee movement has become a crisis.
For Syrian refugees, Europe's shores symbolize sanctuary.
Go back!
But in recent days, families fleeing Turkey to reach Greece have been met by aggressive Greek military boats and even gunfire.
We have children!
And at the Greece-Turkey land border, refugees are rebuffed by concertina wire, armed Greek guards, and sometimes clouds of tear gas. Turkey has allowed, even encouraged, these refugee families to head to the Greek border. That created hope and then anger at the Greeks for blocking the border.
What we care about is finding a safe place for our children. Where can we go? We don't have homes. We don't have work. We don't want anything. All we want is safety.
Safety from the war that's now being fought between Turkey, Syria, and Russia. In Idlib, Syria, Russian-backed Syrian government forces are fighting Turkish soldiers and Syrian rebels. Syria has killed almost 60 Turkish soldiers since January. Today in Moscow, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin announced a de-escalation zone inside Syria and a ceasefire.
I express hope that these agreements will serve as good ground for a ceasefire in the Idlib de-escalation zone, will finally put an end to the suffering of the civilian population, and create conditions for a peace process in the Syrian Arab Republic.
Our goal is to prevent the worsening of the humanitarian crisis in the region. We will work together to supply aid for all the Syrians in need without any precondition and discrimination.
But analysts say the ceasefire will prove temporary, and civilians now living in camps will remain caught in the crossfire. Hundreds of thousands face an advance by the Syrian regime and Russia and have fled as close to the Turkish border as they can, but Turkey refuses to open this border. Syrian children, whose country has been at war all their life, bear the brunt. The International Rescue Committee says 60% of parents say their kids cry for no reason. These siblings fled airstrikes and were living in a police station. They had to flee from there, too. Asil is 14.
We were hit. The airstrikes hit the police station, and a few raids hit beforehand, too. We're leaving our home so my siblings won't be afraid, and my mother won't be scared.
Earlier this week, senior U.S. officials visited Idlib and pledged humanitarian aid and ammunition to Turkey. But so far, the U.S. has declined Turkish requests for greater intervention.
Humanitarian aid is only a response. The real answer is an immediate ceasefire, a durable ceasefire.
But on the Greek border and inside Syria, hundreds of thousands of refugees remain displaced, and a ceasefire doesn't replace their lost homes. Here with me now to discuss Syria, the refugee crisis, and more is the United Kingdom's Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, who's here in Washington, D.C., meeting with U.S. officials. Welcome to the NewsHour, Mr. Secretary. Let's start with Syria. Does NATO have an obligation to assist Turkey in its fight against the Syrian regime and the Russian Air Force in Syria?
NATO has an obligation under Article 5 to any of its members, should they wish to seek to trigger that in collective self-defense. NATO also has an obligation to respond to any member's concerns, and that's why NATO has already had a session at its headquarters to discuss the emerging situation in Syria. And so I think NATO is doing what it can do. It's being supportive of Turkey insofar as understanding the challenges it has and recognizing the security situation right on its border. So I think, NATO is fulfilling those obligations and will always continue to do so under its charter.
Turkey, of course, is a member of NATO, we should remind our viewers, and has asked for more, namely Patriots, for example, from the United States. We saw President Erdogan make another deal with President Putin of Turkey. This is not the first deal that the two have made. Is Idlib an opportunity for the U.S. or NATO to try and help Turkey more, and in so doing, try and perhaps begin to reduce that Turkish-Russian partnership?
I think certainly, what Turkey is learning slightly the hard way is that Russia is one of the most unreliable partners you can have. I think it's not an opportunity. I think it's really the chickens coming home to roost that if you do a deal with Russia, count your fingers when you've finished shaking hands. But I think what is more important is that, the West, Europe, Britain, the United States, we do recognize and are very sympathetic to Turkey's current position. They are already a country full of 3.6 million refugees from that conflict. That's a huge amount for any one country to hold. They're a country who face the direct consequences of a failed Syria. What can the US and the UK do? Well, I think the first thing we can do is what we're going to do, which is we're going to increase our aid to them. We're going to help with the aid for all those refugees to make sure that they are looked after. And then we can, discuss with the Turkish what it is they think we could do to help. I'm off to Turkey next week to visit. My foreign secretary went at the beginning of this week. And I think it's really important that we engage with Turkey, but in a spirit of de-escalation.
Let's spin around the globe and cover some other issues. The United Kingdom has agreed to allow the Chinese telecommunications giant Huawei into the periphery of the 5G system. Before that decision was made, I was reading an interview that you gave in which you said, if we are going to allow countries access to our market, we should expect a code of behavior that is fair play. What assurance do you have that Huawei will play fairly?
Well, we don't have that insurance, which is why there are two parts to this policy. First of all, our policy wasn't allowing them in. I mean, like even some counties and parts of states in the United States, Huawei are already in our commercial networks. And that's partly because we in the West have failed to provide alternatives over the last few years. We felt that having taken technical advice from our leading spy agency, the GCHQ, that we could mitigate its potential threat. We took the view to ban it from our sensitive national security network. So it is not in our defense networks, our intelligence networks, or all those places where we communicate with our allies and ourselves. We're going to cap it in the more commercial, normal consumer-facing parts of the network to 35%. And we're going to work to cut it out over time from the network and replace it or as the network evolves to make sure that it does not become an area that we're dependent on.
You reportedly opposed this decision. Why didn't you resign after it was made?
Look, I'm not going to comment on media speculative articles about national security conversations. They are classified, and indeed, I am part of a government that's collective. I think the reality is, we think, my experts have told me, technically in the 5G, we can contain them. I think the bigger question for all of us in the West is China. How do we change China's behavior? And as you said in the quote, if you want access to our markets and our universities, which, by the way, they are in the United States, they own Walmart, for example, the Chinese, all over our country, how do we change that behavior where we see evidence of, obviously, espionage, IP theft, etc.?
You've praised the U.S.-Taliban agreement just signed because the withdrawal of U.S. troops and NATO troops is conditions-based. But those conditions, as you know, in that agreement are not based on a reduction of violence on the ground long-term or even political progress between the Afghan government and the Taliban. Those conditions for withdrawal are based strictly on the Taliban renouncing al-Qaeda. Are those conditions too narrow?
Well, I think there are more conditions than just that. And my counterpart, Secretary Mark Esper, said today that there are two other parts of the deal.
Although the U.S. has admitted there are two other parts that they're not publicizing, but they're not going to change the fundamentals. They're just about implementation.
Well, the fundamentals are about the direction of travel to reduce violence. I mean, that has been part of the condition. And as you saw previously, when those conditions were broken, President Trump said, that's it, it's done.
The last time that we came close to this deal.
He was very close. He was very clear about that, President Trump. And in fact, it's been reported in the media only yesterday, I think it was, there was an airstrike against threats in Afghanistan. People have criticized people for trying. We have to try. Young men and women from Britain and America and some of our allies died to try and bring peace to Afghanistan. If we don't try, then what's it all been for? But I absolutely hear people's concerns about the conditions. It's got to be real, it's got to be deliverable, and it's got to be long-lasting. And that's why the UK, alongside America, will make sure that any drawdown at the moment is in a position that's going to allow us to continue to take the war on terror, to fight the other threats, the Haqqani network and IS and other parts of that area that are a direct threat. And also that we make sure we work with the Afghan government to ensure that they can come to an accommodation with the Taliban. That's really important. But from my point of view, and as I said in my public statement, this is a small step. We'll do it step by step.
Ben Wallace, Defense Secretary of the United Kingdom, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.